Howdy everyone, I'm Generic Jake, and this is episode 1 of Roleplaying Reviews. In 1974, two men published a game that's impact would reverberate through pop culture across the globe and decades to come. Those men were Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and that game, as you probably know, was Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons was the very first tabletop role-playing game to ever be created. It took aspects of combat from war games which Gygax and Arneson played, but it focused on individual characters as opposed to controlling entire armies. Add in the mix some elves, dwarves, and hobbits from the works of Tolkien, and you have the makings of the first fantasy role-playing game. Fun fact, Gygax was more of a fan of Robert E. Howard's Conan than he was of Tolkien's work. Nevertheless, here we are nearly 5 decades later, and still talking about Dungeons & Dragons. The talk wasn't always pleasant, though. But D&D survived even that ordeal, and continues to print more books and more editions to this day. Which leads me into the subject of today's video, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. D&D 5e came out on August 19th of 2014, and the hobby has seen a boom in popularity since then. Part of that is the rise in interest in the tabletop RPG hobby, and the other half of that would be, well, brand recognition. I was a dumb elementary school kid who didn't know anything about anything, and even I had heard the name Dungeons & Dragons in the past. I mean, heck, it was in E.T. for crying out loud. However, the other thing that helped with that rise in popularity is the number of celebrities playing D&D 5e, like Joe Manganiello, and the entire cast of Critical Role. Because if any of you have been living under a rock and didn't know, there is a show online where people play D&D. Yeah, it's just as much fun to watch people play D&D as it is to play the hobby itself. Or maybe Sam Riegel hypnotized all of us. I believe it. But enough about celebrities and history, let's talk about what you're actually here for. My review of the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition core rule books. Yeah, you're gonna need all 3 of these. So here's how we'll do this. I have 3 categories that I will break this review down into: presentation, mechanics, and themes. I'll discuss each category in turn, give my thoughts on them. Then at the end, I'll talk about my own personal enjoyment of the system and give my recommendations based on that. Also, if you're looking for an objective score, you might want a different review. I am easily entertained. It's a giraffe! Small minds and small things, as they say. And it takes a lot to make me actively hate a game I'm playing. Be aware of that. Well, with that out of the way, let's dive bomb into the review. Now, you say you should never judge a book by its cover. Let's forget about that rule. Anybody who knows anything about selling products knows that you have to catch your customer's eye like that. And let me tell you, these books definitely catch your eye. Looking at them from the side, they all have the same text font, colors, logos, all that stuff. Which is good. That makes them look nice and neat on the bookshelf, and it also helps customers visually realize that these books are all part of the same set. Looking at the front cover, you can see that each one has individual art and colors to make it distinct from the others. The art is also perfectly chosen for what each book is meant to do. The player's handbook has adventurers facing off against a giant, one with a sword, and one casting a spell. The Dungeon Master's Guide has the evil lich Asararak. Well, as the Dungeon Master, you're going to have to be the villain, so hope you're ready to play some big bad evil guys. And finally, we have the Monster Manual, which has a Beholder, one of the most iconic original monsters ever created for D&D. Look at that thing. You don't see stuff like that anywhere else. The art inside is just as good. The player's handbook has art depicting each one of the core races, from elves, dwarves, humans, although the halflings always struck me as a little odd. Let's go with odd. And the art splashed throughout the book has some really good pulp fantasy atmospheres to it. My personal favorite is this one. Every time I look at it, I want to run a heist. The idea of a halfling being lowered down on ropes to pull out some sort of magic item sounds like a lot of fun to me. The Dungeon Master's Guide also has some fantastic art in it, though I have to admit, the best art in this whole book has got to be found in Chapter 7, which is the treasure chapter. Here, almost every magic item has artwork to go alongside of it, and trust me, there is no better idea than showing your players some of this visual representation. Boots of Winter, you can clearly see right here with a frost on the bottom of it. I could talk about the magic items in here forever. Of the 3 books, though, the best art has to go to the Monster Manual, because all of the big monsters have drawings to depict them, and man, they can be intimidating. Good point there. I could talk about these just as much as the magic items, and honestly, I'd love to do a top favorite monsters in the Monster Manual. Leave a comment down below if you want to see that one day, and I'll see what I can do. All of the art in these books has an awesome fantasy pulp feel that really captures the spirit of what you're trying to do. Mechanics are where we get into the meat of the system. A game's not a game if it doesn't have rules to govern how to play. It would just be an art book, like you would get with a video game collector's edition, minus the video game. Sounds like a Bethesda collector's edition. D&D is a D20 based system, which means that this little plastic orb can literally mean the difference between life and death for your character. Or you, if your DM happens to be Jigsaw.
I want to play a game.
To determine success or failure in D&D, you roll a d20 and add the appropriate modifiers to the roll. The most common way to get a modifier is from one of your 6 core attributes. Some of you have probably heard the tomato explanation before, but it's how I explain these stats to new players, so here we go. Strength is your ability to crush a tomato in your hands. Dexterity is your ability to dodge out of the way of a tomato thrown at you. Constitution is your ability to eat a rotten tomato and not get sick. Intelligence is knowing that tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put that in your fruit salad. And then finally, charisma is your ability to sell some poor sap that tomato fruit salad that you whipped up. All player characters and non-player characters alike have these same 6 stats, so it's good to know them whether you're a player or the Dungeon Master. An average human, such as a commoner, has a 10 in every stat, which applies a +0 to rolls using that ability. Having an ability score higher than 10 gives you a positive modifier, ranging from a +1 with a score of 12 to a whopping +10 to rolls if you have a 30 in the ability score. Meanwhile, having a score lower than 10 gives you a negative modifier, with a -1 if you have a score of 9, all the way down to a 5 if you have a score of 1. Don't worry, that probably won't happen though. Probably. No promises! Previous editions of D&D and Pathfinder, but I'll talk about that some other time, used additional modifiers based on whether your character had cover, was flanking an enemy, was blessed by the gods that day, or had to fart during an important negotiation. All of those numbers could be very confusing, especially if you have a 9 in intelligence like I do. Fortunately, 5e simplified circumstance bonuses and penalties into the simple advantage and disadvantage system, which works as such. Have advantage on a roll, roll twice, and take the higher result. Have disadvantage on a roll, roll twice, and take the lower result. Have both, well, in that case, advantage and disadvantage cancel each other out, so you just roll a single die as normal. This system is much simpler than having to worry about another number which modifies your roll. Monsters have a lot of unique, complicated abilities, so if you're going to be the Dungeon Master, I'd say you really need to read into how each individual monster works before you go throwing it in. Trust me, I tried to do it without reading the stat blocks. Did not go well. If you're ever confused about any mechanics, just look in either the Player's Handbook or in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and there's probably an explanation that you can check the index for. But most mechanics just boil down to roll a d20 and compare it to a target number. So the mechanics of this game are not too complex, but they're also not overly simple. If you have too simple of a game, then eventually people might get bored of it, as it's no longer challenging to them. Just imagine if there was a game where you just had to go, roll a die, I win. That's not fun. On the other hand, if a game is too complex, then, well, every session just becomes a slog of looking up individual rules in the rule book, figuring out what you need to do, and then calculating out math on your rolls. And that's not fun either. 5e is in this Goldilocks zone. It's not too complex, not too simple, it's just right. The most complex role at the table is always going to be the Dungeon Master, but there are a lot of tools online that can help you with that. From initiative trackers, there's HP trackers, there's all kinds of things to help you visualize your maps out. So, if you ever need any help as a Dungeon Master, just look online, ask forums. There's always going to be a tool to help you out with that. And now we come to themes. Themes in tabletop RPGs are generally the genre and the types of stories that you can tell with the system. And D&D is a fantasy through and through. However, it has enough tools to let the Dungeon Master decide what type of fantasy they want to tell. Maybe you want to run a dark fantasy with elements of horror, where characters are surviving the rule of a bloody vampire. Maybe you want sword and sorcery, where the characters are less heroes as much as they are profiteers out for their own gain. Or maybe you want to run something crazy like science fantasy, where magic is used to power strange alien devices. Yeah, that exists. All of these are possible with 5e's rules, including some variant rules that you can change up as you need. Just remember that the core of the system is still fantasy, and that you might have a hard time running a space western if that's what you're after. There's some better games for that. The Dungeon Master's Guide is full of optional rules and systems you can implement to fit the themes that you want. Maybe you want to consider switching the healing system to require a longer time if you want gritty, dark fantasy. Maybe you want to do a samurai fantasy and you want to include the honor score. Or maybe you just want to give the party an alien gun. That could be fun. In addition, the monster manual is chock full of monsters of different shapes and sizes. Depending on what kind of game you want to run, The monster manual has exactly what you need to fit that theme, from alien monstrosities to the horrors that lurk in the night. And flumps. I love flumps. On the player's end, the theme of fantasy is held up by the class system. And no, I don't mean the medieval hierarchy which keeps the rich getting richer and the peasants down in the dirt. It's more like Final Fantasy's job system. Wonder where they got the inspiration for that. Wait a minute. The player's handbook has 12 core classes to choose from. And if I want to keep this video relatively short, I don't have time to talk about them in detail. But to list them off, they are Barbarian, Bard, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, Warlock, and...
You're a wizard, Harry.
If you want to know more about the classes, go watch XP to level 3. They're a better channel anyway. So, between the monsters, the magic items, the classes, the spells, and just the general feel of the game, D&D has perfectly encapsulated the theme of fantasy. Finally, we come to the overall enjoyment of the system, and let me start this by saying 5th edition D&D was really the first tabletop game that I got hooked to. So, I'm pretty biased towards the system. I love the character creation system. It's super easy to choose a race, background, and class and just run with it. Plus, each class has individual subclasses, which means that even if you play 2 fighters in a row, you don't have to play the same fighter twice. Add on a super simple multi-class system and the feat system, and it means that character customization is super fun. That's a little bit of the complexity that it can keep veteran players coming back and interested. I love being able to build highly customized characters, and there's not too many options that causes what I like to call option paralysis. You know, when a game has so many options that you don't even know where to begin with choosing something. DMing 5e is perhaps my favorite aspect of the game. The DM's Guide and Monster Manual are filled with tools to use. My favorite part being the random adventure and dungeon tables that even if you don't roll on them, they can still give you inspiration to know exactly what you want to do. I engage with D&D 5e not just as a player, but as a DM and a community member. I watch YouTube videos and Critical Role. I talk on forums like Reddit about the game. There's barely anyone out there in the tabletop community who hasn't played 5e, and if they haven't played, then, well, they've at least seen it or heard of it. You can find a game of 5e pretty much anywhere you go. As long as someone has internet access or any small town that has a tabletop game store, they've got 5e, and you've got people to play with. D&D 5e is not a perfect game. There's no such thing as perfection. But the game is perfect as an introduction to new players and is still fun as a veteran coming back dozens of adventures later. That's why I recommend D&D to anyone that's interested in it. Thank you all so much for joining me for episode 1 of Roleplaying Reviews. I hope you like the video and subscribe. Please leave a comment down below with any games you'd like to see reviewed. And let me give a special shout out to a couple of my friends. Damien, Patrick, Steven, and of course my girlfriend Lara. Thank you all so much for supporting me in this. I hope you guys will stick around. See you next time.